that you may be reviewing for many different reasons. Some of you may be taking a training that is related to this journey storytelling, or you may be viewing it, reviewing it because your employer is having you do a training that I've created, and we want you to know what my credentials are in terms of being able to offer these trainings. And I usually just, rather than list my resume, I like to tell this story because I think it's really helpful for all of us. And I do a retreat self-study workshop where I have you work with your own journey and we talk about our stories. So you may be doing it for that reason. But regardless of your reason for being here, I'm just going to go through a slide-by-slide presentation using an artistic piece that I usually create in a retreat workshop setting, as I mentioned, so that it will help you understand my credentials. My degree work is in psychology and counseling, and my education degree work is in Waldorf education and in learning and behavior disorders, and I've been teaching for over 34 years. I'm now 64 and have really seen a lot in my lifetime related to these implicit bias, racist, anti-racist journeys. And I love making them with people so that we can really uncover and honor the things that we've been told and learned. And in my journey, I have really come to believe, after many periods of self-examination, that this was really from a very early time in my childhood. Having such an unusual upbringing for somebody who was born in 1956, that this is certainly part of my purpose, which is different than my career, although they have dovetailed. So many of you may know me through my education workshops, and hopefully you're also aware that I do this work and have for quite a long time. So here's my story, and I encourage you to tell your own. I love this particular poem by this poet, so I'll just give you a minute to read it. Things that should be asked often in every type of relationship. How is your heart? Is your breath happy here? Do you feel free? And here you have a photograph of a really large artistic piece that I created to use in my workshops. You can see down here my mom, my dad, my grandmother, my grandfather, and how that kind of mind mapped through my childhood and where I grew up and different things I learned from different spaces. So I kind of organized mine based on people and places. But you can organize yours based on anything you want. If we are doing the workshop on this, we'll talk about that. But for now, if you're just reviewing for review's sake, just know that that's how I organized this. And you can see that church, school, the YMCA, my neighborhood, my high school, my college, and down here you can see my family as a kind of foundation for all of this that came. So that's how I created mine. And you can read some of the notes I made to myself. I'll reference those from time to time. So here I have my dad. My dad was born to two people who were both social workers, which for that time was extremely unusual. So already out of the gate, you know, I had these very unusual grandparents on that side of my family. And my dad had polio and lost the use of his leg when he was in high school. So I was born to someone who had a physical appearance that was already different. So I learned when I learned to walk, I actually imitated him walking with one leg. So that may not sound important with regard to racism, but it establishes for me as a young child a difference that I was already acclimated to. So differences were not differences to me, if that makes sense. So you might want to think a little bit about that on your own journey. You know, my grandparents were social workers, and my father came from an extremely wealthy family, and on both sides, but they both became social workers instead of, you know, living with that wealth. So it's very interesting already. Again, you know, you can kind of see in my background how that was important. And my dad eventually became city councilor for the city of St. Louis. And so when I was very young, he would talk to me about the laws. And he actually, when I was probably about 10 years old, explained redlining to me as a young child. So just to kind of let you know that, you know, he really had this incredible influence on me. And then later in life, he was general counsel for Peabody Coal. And so I learned a lot from him about coal miners and laws, and we didn't see eye to eye a lot of times, as you can imagine. So, you know, he really, though, informed me all along the way and often spoke very honestly with me as a young child about racism in terms of the laws of the city of St. Louis, which he, you know, being city councilor, had a lot to do with. So that was really important. And if I go back to my mom, you can see here, she grew up part of her life in an orphanage. And then when she did move home, she grew up on a street called St. Louis Avenue, which by the time I was born and my nanny lived there and we'd see her every Sunday, she was the only white person on that block, on that street. And my mom told me when they lived at the orphanage, when my grandmother couldn't afford to feed them, they would stay at the orphanage, which was down the street. She told me that when they were kids, they would sneak the black children in their neighborhood onto the playground so they would have enough kids to make a team. So whether she was living at home or at the orphanage, she had this experience with black children, and she always told me that she never understood why they couldn't play, and so she broke the rules and let them, which was really unusual for my parents to be talking to me about this stuff. And then also every Sunday from, you know, once I was raised Catholic, once church was over, we would go to Nanny's house for, you know, the entire afternoon and dinner until the evening. And so I as a very young child, from when I was a baby on, until my grandmother moved, which was not until much later, till I was 8, 9 or so, played with black children. So for me, having those experiences normalized those relationships, and having my parents talk to me about the realities of those relationships was really unusual. So not only were they, you know, normalized for me, but talking about the injustices was normalized for me. So I really learned at a very young age, and I really have come to believe that that is what made a difference for me. So if we go on, this is my grandmother. Like I said, she was a social worker in Chicago. She had a lot of influence on me. I don't know what I'm doing there. I look like I'm about to take flight. All right, so I grew up in a white racist neighborhood, no matter where I lived. So in St. Louis, I lived in 4 different neighborhoods growing up, and they were all white and they were all racist. So even though I had these other experiences, I did grow up with very racist, openly racist individuals in my neighborhood, and my parents always spoke up about it. And so I had these models in them for that experience. Again, normalizing speaking up and not tolerating it versus, you could have said, well, they were people who were not racist themselves, or prejudice actually would be the better term, but they didn't speak up. They did. And so they normalized that for me growing up. I watched them do that, and they talked about it with me. So here you see my mom. She was poor. She was an athlete, by the way. She was not educated past high school. And so as a woman, she talked a lot about how she would have loved to have been a professional athlete. So that also kind of normalized the idea that you talk about obstacles that existed for people. My parents took me to a pediatrician who was Japanese during a time when people had a lot of prejudice about the Japanese people in our country. And also, there were internment camps for Japanese citizens of the United States. So my parents, I honestly don't know. I've never asked them why they chose Dr. Sato, but my whole life I had a Japanese pediatrician. And I heard about that from people. And my parents always, again, they normalized speaking up. So also through my dad, I got involved with the YMCA, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that, again, normalized these experiences for me growing up. I was sent to a Catholic school, and I had a nun in 4th grade named Sister Marie Stevens who changed my entire life in 4th grade. So this is her. And I looked for her my whole life once I knew her, because she came into an all-white, white racist Catholic community and taught us about the civil rights movement. So unheard of, right? Again, my upbringing was so unusual. And she taught us the book, The Little Prince, which I never forgot either. But I'll never forget those images and those stories she told us about the civil rights movement. And within a few weeks, she was gone. She disappeared from my life. But I never forgot her, and I continued looking for her all my life. And as an adult, about 5 years ago, I met someone who was writing a book about Black Catholic nuns in the civil rights movement. And sure enough, someone contacted me because they knew this story. They had seen my biography, and they came in contact with an author who was writing that book from a university in Tennessee. And she put me in touch with her family. Unfortunately, by then she had died. She died right before I made that contact, which was really heartbreaking for me. But I did get to meet her family and see where she was buried. And I really believe for her to come into my life at that time was a big part of my purpose in life. And she gave me my first real introduction to all of that work and the importance of it from her perspective. Before that, I had only known it from listening to my parents and my grandparents. So I grew up in the YMCA. The YMCA that I went to, oddly enough, again, I was very young. This was maybe 1962 through in the 1970s when I graduated from high school in 1974. And I went to the YMCA and worked at the YMCA that entire time. So the YMCA was a big part of my upbringing and influence. It allowed me to go live in the rainforests in South America and Colombia. It allowed me to experience an integrated community of learners, whether it was learning how to swim, learning how to canoe at the camp, didn't matter. It was an integrated community of learners. And some of our leaders were Black and some were white. And many of the families that lived in the neighborhood of the YMCA where I went were poor white families. So it was a really interesting experience for me growing up, and it had a lot of influence. I made friends there when I was at camp after the age of 10 or 11, who I remained friends with through high school. Unfortunately, lost touch with them in college, but had long-lasting friendships because of that. And I remember an incident that really shaped my thinking was that one of my friends was coming to spend the night from camp. It was the first time I'd ever done that. And her mother called my mother, and I could hear my mother crying on the phone with the door closed. And she came out after a long time, and she had obviously been crying the whole time. And I asked her what was wrong. And as I mentioned, my parents were very forthcoming with me, and they normalized honesty about race. Still blows me away to this day. My mom kept me home from school to watch Dr. King, to watch different events on TV. It was just very unusual. But she did tell me that the mother of my friend did not believe that she would be safe in my white neighborhood. And so we made arrangements for her to come, but my parents, my father and I, had to go to her door and pick her up, and we had to commit to her safety, and my father had to make arrangements for her to be safe. And as city councilor of the city, he was able to do that. And then, of course, I was able to go to their homes. We lived on the opposite sides of St. Louis. I lived in South St. Louis. They lived in North St. Louis. But because of this integrated camp, it normalized these friendships, and it normalized me traveling back and forth. But I already, because of my nanny's house, she lived in North St. Louis. So, again, very unusual, but important to understand how these things work when you're growing up and what a difference they make. So again, my camp was integrated. And again, oops, let me get rid of that for you. So this is a picture from where I lived in South America in the camp. Again, these were, I was comfortable with people who didn't look or talk like me. So I was able to live in this rainforest where there was no phones, nothing. And it was comfortable for me. And I was 16 at the time. But it had another, again, great influence on me. And then I went to college. And of course, by then I had gone through high school dating. I tried to bring one of the young men from my camp experiences on a date to my high school, and it didn't work out. It was really awful. I had a lot of experiences like that, but my parents had brought me up to be vocal, and they had normalized speaking up and doing what you think is right. And so, those kinds of things came naturally to me. I had friends who, one of my best friends, her father was the first Black judge in the Supreme Court in Missouri, and my father worked with Clarence Thomas, so I was around people that were Black that also were successful, and a lot of firsts in my world growing up. So I did not grow up with thinking that Black people worked for me, or, I always grew up believing, again, what was normalized for me was that people who were Black also had positions that were prestigious. So you can see that, my upbringing really normalized a lot of the things that have to do with bias and race. I worked with Native American communities growing up because of the YMCA, lots of things that I haven't included here, but I think you can see how you can do your own biography. What was normalized for you? And try to understand the people and places that made it that way. So as an adult, some of my work-related accomplishments that contribute to this is I was hired by the Muhammad Ali Center before it opened to create their educational foundation and curriculum. So I'm very proud of that, and I was able to help shape what you see happening at the Ali Center now. This was when it first opened. You can see right here, here I am standing I was in charge of the opening ceremony for the community. And this gentleman here, Bob Cunningham, he's right here in the photograph. He ended up working with me on the 2 Centuries of Black Louisville curriculum that I wrote. So it was kind of funny to see me looking out over that crowd there. And I didn't know him at the time, but he came to be a very important figure in my professional career and curriculum writing. This is the Ali's here with Bill Clinton. This is my grandson with his I Am Ali shirt on. And here's Lonnie Muhammad, who are standing next to me. Here you can't see them in the picture here, but this was that day when we opened the center, and that was the ceremony and curriculum and all that work that I did for the Ali Center. And I have done curriculum work with Lily Ye, who works in Rwanda. This here is the last king, King Kigeli, from the country of Rwanda in Africa. He was the exiled king. He lived here in the United States, and I wrote curriculum and worked with him on telling his story. This is a young lady at Frost Middle School from JCPS. And so that was curriculum I created for many years of work in that area. I also have written a lot of curriculum about schools and come to understand what school is a lot differently. It's kind of hard to see here. This is a picture from the school in Rwanda. These are pieces of art sent from our country. This is from curriculum I wrote about Darfur. This is a school in the middle of that area, in that refugee camp. And I wrote curriculum for a film that was took place about what was happening in Darfur. So I did a lot of curriculum writing about Africa, the various countries in Africa, and came to understand the importance of those stories related to our own history here in the United States. And I've done a lot of curriculum work with Facing History and Ourselves, a lot of writing and work there. And this was from a training I did with the state of Wyoming's history teachers. We had 4 or 5 days, and I worked for almost a year with these young people from the Wyoming Indian School, and we had them come in and teach their history to the Wyoming history teachers. It was very powerful, a really different experience to have them teach the history rather than me train them in it. So it was a real something I'm very happy that I got to do. This was a little greeting they sent me at Christmas time. This is a gentleman named Tom Moffat, and he, Bob Cunningham, lots of others who are part of the Kentucky Civil Rights Archives. I was able to work with them and write curriculum for the Ann Braden Center. I wrote curriculum for 2 Centuries of Black Louisville and implemented it for many, many years in the JCPS schools, and have done training for over 15 years about that in various topics. So I wrote curriculum and worked with the Ann Braden Institute regarding her work in the community. And again, it's, you know, the same curriculum writing that I've been doing for, gosh, it's over 20 years now. So all of this is primarily focused on local history in terms of Mr. Moffat and Ann Braden, Bob Cunningham, and Muhammad Ali. And I have several children's books that I wrote with kids where they actually told those stories. And because of all the work that I've mentioned, that I've done, some I've mentioned, some I haven't, but that all kind of culminated about 3 or 4 years ago when I was named a Campaign for Black Male Achievement Fellow, a beloved community fellow, and had a lot of training for a year working with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement and the Beloved Community Fellowship in North Carolina. So I've had a lot of training, and all of these individuals I'm pictured here with, I've worked with them and had training with them on their organization's work. So it's been a very intense process, and I'm very grateful for it. I still keep in touch with all, well, not all of them, but most of them. So that's been a really important relationship to me recently. And so now I continue my work. As you can see, it's been a big part of my life. This has been kind of my philosophy. I hope your way is rough and that the disturbance becomes your sanctuary. And I really owe that to Sister Marie Stevens, who really taught me at, 4th grade that I should expect to be disturbed by what I saw when I saw injustice of any kind. And I saw a lot of it with regard to my sister, my father, family members, all kinds of people I haven't mentioned. But I really, because of my unique life experience, witnessed a lot of injustice in my personal relationships with Black men and women, or Black boys and girls. It became very clear to me as I was growing up, as a young adult, as an adult, that I was not treated the same way. And, from being pulled over every night by the same police officer when I was driving my friend who was Black and male home from work because he and I worked at the same place, to injustices I still see now in classrooms. I have come to believe that this disturbance is my sanctuary, and I encourage all of us as white people to join this journey so that we can end this disease for this generation. So these are my grandsons sleeping happily together, all curled up, and my hope is that as white boys, they can grow up and understand things just as I was taught to understand, and also join in making the disturbance a sanctuary. Thanks for listening.